Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. We've all been there, talking with someone who believes something so strongly they can't even imagine being wrong. And when that belief is religious, the conversation can feel like a minefield. You don't want to offend, but you also don't want to nod along with something you fundamentally disagree with. So the question is, how do you handle religious arguments without wasting your time or your sanity? The first thing to understand is that most religious arguments aren't about truth. They're about identity. When someone argues for their religion, they're not just defending an idea, they're protecting their sense of self, their place in the world, their family traditions, their afterlife insurance policy, all rolled into one. That's why facts alone don't usually work. Not because people are stupid, but because beliefs tied to emotion and belonging aren't easily shaken by logic. So if someone starts quoting scripture at you or making claims about divine intervention, you don't need to rush into a debate. You can pause, ask questions instead of firing back. Not sarcastically, not aggressively, just calmly and curiously. Why do you believe that? What do you mean by that exactly? How did you come to that conclusion? That kind of approach disarms the usual fight or flight reaction. It makes the conversation feel less like a battle and more like an exploration. Because the truth is, most religious people haven't thought very deeply about why they believe what they believe. They've been told since childhood, rewarded for repeating it, warned not to question it. So when you ask, why do you think that's true? You're not attacking, you're just introducing a moment of silence, space for doubt, and sometimes that's all it takes. But let's say they come prepared, armed with arguments they've memorized, design in nature, first cause, moral absolutes. These are common, and the key is not to get overwhelmed by the structure of their argument. It's okay to slow the pace down, ask what each point actually means, and whether it's the best explanation available. Because often, it's not. Take the design argument. The claim that the universe is so finely tuned it must have had a designer. That sounds impressive at first, but ask yourself, does complexity automatically mean intention? We see patterns everywhere, clouds that look like faces, numbers that feel special. But we know that doesn't prove purpose. Complexity can emerge from natural processes. Evolution, physics, chemistry, these systems are messy, slow, and full of trial and error. If a watch implies a watchmaker, then why does the watch of life have so many flaws, blind spots, errors, extinct species, birth defects? And then there's the first cause argument, the idea that everything must have a cause, so the universe needs a creator. But there's a contradiction hiding inside that logic. If everything needs a cause, then what caused the creator? And if something can exist without a cause, like God, then why not just stop with the universe? Why insert a middleman that creates more questions than answers? The moral argument comes up often too. People say, you can't have morality without God. But look around. Do we really get our sense of right and wrong from holy books? Or is it more likely that our sense of empathy, fairness, and harm avoidance evolves socially? That it's baked into our brains through millions of years of living in groups. Because if religion were the only source of morality, then why do moral values shift across cultures and time? Why did religious texts support slavery or stoning or crusades, while most people today, even believers, reject those ideas? It's not that religion created morality. It's that religion has always been downstream from human values, not the source of them. Another thing to keep in mind during these arguments is that belief isn't just about arguments. It's often about comfort. People want to believe there's a plan, a purpose, that their suffering isn't meaningless. And if you take that belief away without offering something better, it can feel like cruelty. That's why blunt logic sometimes backfires, not because it's wrong, but because it leaves a hole. So when you challenge a religious claim, try not to just poke holes. Try to offer clarity. You don't have to promise comfort, but you can offer honesty, intellectual freedom, the ability to say, I don't know, without shame. That's something religious systems rarely allow, and that on its own can be freeing. Most of the time, religious arguments follow a familiar pattern. Someone makes a claim, they appeal to faith or tradition or personal experience, and they expect you to respect it as untouchable. But faith, by definition, is belief without evidence. And personal experience, while meaningful, isn't proof. We don't accept anecdote as data in science, so why should it carry the same weight when the stakes are eternal? When someone says, "I know God exists because I feel Him in my heart," you can respect their sincerity without pretending that counts as evidence. People feel all sorts of things: fear, love, awe, guilt. That doesn't make them true in an objective sense. If truth was defined by feeling, we'd all believe different things and call them equally valid. But the real world doesn't work that way. What about miracles? That's another common card. Someone tells you about a time their prayer was answered, or someone survived something unlikely. The problem is, improbable things happen all the time. That's just statistics. We only call them miracles when we notice them. We ignore the prayers that go unanswered. The sick people who don't get better, the tragedies that happen every day. Miracle is just a name we give to the rare times when something good lines up with what we want to believe. Sometimes, religious arguments are more emotional than intellectual. A person might ask you, "Well, what if you're wrong?" trying to scare you into belief. But fear is not a reason to accept something. It's a reason to question it more closely. If a belief only works because it frightens people into submission, then it's not about truth, it's about control. That question, "What if you're wrong?" cuts both ways. What if they're wrong? What if they've built their life around an illusion? What if they've spent years worshiping an idea that never loved them back? That's not a comfortable question, but it's one worth asking. It helps to remember that people often cling to religion not because it answers questions, but because it silences them. The feeling of certainty is addictive, the idea that someone out there has a plan, that everything happens for a reason, it's comforting. But comfort isn't the same thing as reality. And when that comfort is challenged, people can get defensive, not because you've said something cruel, but because you've touched a nerve. It's not your job to fix their reaction. What you can do, though, is keep your own response grounded, calm, thoughtful. That kind of tone, quiet and steady, is often more powerful than any counter-argument. One technique that works surprisingly well is just being okay with not knowing. You don't have to have every answer to every claim. You can say, "That's an interesting point, but I'd want to see evidence before I believe it." Or, "I'm not convinced that explains things better than what we already know from science." That's not evasive, it's intellectually honest. Because when someone brings up a religious claim, they're making a positive assertion, a statement about reality. And the burden of proof is on the person making the claim, not the one questioning it. If I say, "There's a dragon in my garage," it's not your job to prove me wrong, it's my job to prove I'm right. This simple rule, the burden of proof gets lost in a lot of religious discussions. People act like skepticism is just another belief system. But questioning isn't a belief, it's a method. It's how we filter truth from fiction. And without that filter, anything can sound true for a while. Sometimes people try to flip that around. They'll say, "Well, you can't prove God doesn't exist," but that's not how proof works. You can't disprove a vague, unfalsifiable idea. You can't disprove invisible unicorns or time-traveling aliens either. That doesn't mean they're equally likely. It means the question is malformed. When someone argues from faith, they're stepping outside the rules of reason altogether. Faith, by its nature, is belief without, or in spite of, evidence. So when someone says, "I believe it because I have faith," they're really saying, "I believe it because I want to." And that might be emotionally satisfying, but it's not an argument. In some cases, religious debates aren't even about religion at all. They're about power. Cultural power, political power, the fear of losing a worldview that gives someone a sense of control. That's why people get so angry when their beliefs are questioned. They're not just defending an idea, They're defending the scaffolding of their lives. And that's why facts often bounce off, because the belief isn't suspended by reason, it's reinforced by identity, emotion, and fear. If you pull out one logical plank, the rest of the structure doesn't fall. It just reshapes itself to avoid collapse. That can be frustrating, but it's also a reminder that winning an argument isn't the goal. The real goal, if you have one, is clarity, integrity, making sure your side of the conversation is grounded, honest, and thoughtful. That's the kind of conversation people remember later, long after they've forgotten the specific words. You'll also hear arguments that try to use science as a launching pad for belief. People will say things like, "The Big Bang proves God," or even scientists believe in something beyond. But that's a misuse of science. Science is a process, not a belief system. It doesn't deal in absolutes. It builds models, runs experiments, revises its views based on new data. And when scientists don't know something, like what happened before the Big Bang, they don't just fill the gap with a God. They say, "We don't know yet." That humility is actually a strength, but religious arguments often frame it as a weakness. Another thing to watch for is when someone moves the goalposts. Maybe you refute one claim and they just jump to another. It's a kind of rhetorical shell game. The moment you touch one argument, another one slides into place. That's not a real conversation. It's a defense mechanism. You don't have to chase every moving target. You can stop and say, let's stick to one point at a time. Or even if every argument you offer can be swapped for another, then do any of them actually stand on their own? That kind of pause resets the tempo. It forces the other person to slow down and really consider what they're saying. There's also a psychological layer here that rarely gets talked about. Belief can act like a kind of cognitive armor, protecting people from painful questions, from existential dread, from uncertainty. It creates a tight boundary around what they're allowed to think. And when you question that belief, it can feel like you're breaking into their mental safe zone. So if someone starts getting emotional or upset or shuts down, don't take it personally. You may have just tapped into something deeper than logic. And sometimes backing off is more respectful and more effective than pushing harder. That doesn't mean you stay silent forever. It just means you read the room. You wait for the right moment, because seeds of doubt don't grow in hostile soil. They grow in quiet spaces, with time, with curiosity. One of the most underused tools in these conversations is silence. Not awkward silence, but thoughtful silence. A moment where you just let a question hang, without filling it in. What if there's no grand purpose? What if death really is the end? What if morality doesn't need a divine lawgiver? You don't need to answer those right away. Let them echo, because those are the real questions. Not the ones people memorize from apologetics books, but the ones that actually matter to how we live, how we treat each other, and how we face the unknown. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a religious conversation is admit your own uncertainty. Not as a weakness, but as a strength. Because it shows you're not afraid of the unknown. You're not scrambling to fill every gap with comforting stories. You're willing to live with open questions without forcing answers that don't hold up. And that's something a lot of religious arguments can't offer. They have answers, sure, but they're rigid, unmoving, carved into stone before the questions were even asked. That's the appeal to some people, but it's also the limitation. Real understanding grows when you allow your views to evolve, when you stay open to change. You might also notice that many religious arguments come wrapped in politeness, but underneath, they're not neutral. When someone says, "I'll pray for you," it might sound kind, but it's often a soft way of saying, "You're broken, and I know what you need." It assumes a position of superiority, of having something you lack. You don't need to respond with hostility. You can just say, "Thanks, but I prefer solutions that work in this world." or even just nod and move on. Not every comment deserves a rebuttal. Some aren't invitations to debate. They're just expressions of belief. And it's okay to let those slide. But when the conversation does go deeper, when someone genuinely wants to understand why you don't believe, that's your chance to offer something real, not just rebuttals, but an alternative way of thinking. You can talk about the power of critical thinking, the beauty of a universe that doesn't need a caretaker, the freedom of living without fear of eternal punishment, or the moral weight of knowing this life is the only one we're guaranteed. Those aren't cold, emotionless ideas. They're grounded and human. And for some people, hearing that might be the first time they realize there's life beyond doctrine. There's meaning without mythology. One overlooked angle in these discussions is how religion handles doubt, or rather, how it often punishes it. In many traditions, questioning is seen as sinful, disloyal, dangerous. That tells you something. If a belief can't survive scrutiny, then maybe it doesn't deserve immunity. By contrast, skepticism doesn't fear questions. It welcomes them. That's a huge difference. And it's worth highlighting when people accuse you of being close-minded for not believing. Because what's really more close-minded? Asking for evidence or refusing to consider alternatives. There's also the issue of moral guilt. Some religious arguments lean on the idea that without belief, you're somehow morally adrift, that without a higher power, you can't have purpose or compassion or accountability. But that's just not true. In fact, morality rooted in human well-being, in empathy and harm reduction, is often more consistent than systems based on divine command. Because if morality depends on what a god says, then it becomes arbitrary. Whatever the deity commands is good by definition, even if it contradicts human decency. That's how you end up with commandments that ban curiosity, or stories where genocide is framed as obedience. When morality is outsourced to authority, dangerous things become justifiable. But when morality is grounded in reason and shared humanity, it has to earn its keep. And here's the irony. When you challenge someone's religious views respectfully, with reason, with questions, with genuine curiosity, you're actually showing more intellectual respect than most religious teachings ever do. Because you're assuming they can handle the truth, that they're strong enough to question, brave enough to think for themselves. Religions don't often extend that trust. They discourage independent thinking. They call it doubt, heresy, rebellion. But when you have a conversation rooted in honesty and rationality, you're doing the opposite. You're saying, I trust your mind enough to tell you the truth as I see it. And sometimes that honesty will land not right away, but later, after the heat of the conversation is gone, after the fear has cooled. In the quiet, people replay those talks in their heads. And what sticks isn't the clever counterpoint. It's the tone, the calm confidence, the refusal to fake agreement. Over time, that kind of presence can shift someone's whole worldview, not because you forced it, but because you modeled something different. Of course, some conversations won't go anywhere. Some people won't budge an inch. They'll defend every contradiction. They'll double down, get defensive, maybe even insult you. And that's okay. You're not obligated to fix anyone. You're not responsible for their belief system. What matters is that you stay clear in your own reasoning. You set boundaries, and you protect your own peace. Because trying to reason with someone who's not reasoning in good faith is like arguing with a brick wall. It's not a conversation. It's an emotional ritual. And you can opt out. You can say, I'm happy to have this discussion if it's honest and respectful, but I'm not here to be preached to. That's not rude. That's self-respect. And it teaches others that belief isn't a trump card, that your time and attention are valuable. One tactic that can work, when used carefully, is pointing out double standards. For example, if someone dismisses every other religion as false but believes theirs is uniquely true, you can ask, how do you know yours is the one exception? Or if they reject other people's holy experiences but accept their own as proof, you can say, why is your experience more valid than theirs? These aren't gotcha questions. They're structural questions. They make people examine their filters. Because at the end of the day, religious arguments often fail to apply their own logic consistently. They make claims that only work when you already believe and fall apart when you zoom out. And that's the strange thing about many religious arguments. They sound persuasive only inside the circle of belief. Outside of it, once you stop assuming the conclusions, they start to feel hollow, recycled, even self-refuting. Like when someone says, the Bible says God exists, so it must be true. But of course, that's circular. That's like saying a character in a novel proves the author exists in real life. It's not evidence, it's just part of the narrative. And when people defend miracles or divine intervention by pointing to rare coincidences, they ignore all the normal explanations. They zoom in on the 1-in-a-million event and say, see, proof. But they never ask, what about the 999,999 other cases that didn't go that way? That's how confirmation bias works. We notice what fits and ignore what doesn't. It's not dishonest, it's just human, but it leads to a lot of bad reasoning. And in religion, that kind of thinking is often rewarded, not challenged. So one of the most helpful things you can do in any religious argument is to slow the conversation down. Don't react emotionally. Don't try to win the argument. Try to make it real instead. What are they actually saying? What assumptions are baked into their claim? Are they offering evidence or just asserting something with confidence and calling that proof? Because confidence and truth aren't the same thing. Someone can be absolutely certain and still be completely wrong. We all know that. But in religious discussions, certainty is often mistaken for credibility. And sometimes you'll hear this one, but look at all the good religion does, the charities, the communities, the hospitals. Sure, religion can motivate people to do good things, but that doesn't make its claims about gods or miracles true. You could say the same about patriotism, or music, or fandoms. Just because something inspires people doesn't mean it's based on reality. The question isn't, does religion make some people behave well? The question is, are its truth claims supported by evidence? And if someone says, well, it doesn't matter if it's true, it helps me cope, then that's not an argument, that's a confession. They're admitting the belief isn't about truth, it's about comfort, and that's fine as long as they don't expect everyone else to live by it. Because beliefs influence behavior, and when a comforting belief starts being used to control others, to make laws, to justify discrimination, then it stops being a private comfort and becomes a public concern. That's why religious arguments don't just stay in churches or temples. They spill into politics, into schools, into healthcare. And that's where pushback matters. That's where clear thinking matters. You don't have to be rude to be firm. You can say, I respect your right to believe whatever you want, but I don't accept faith as a basis for public policy. Or, if a belief can't be questioned, it shouldn't be used to govern other people's lives. Those kinds of lines don't attack the person, but they do defend your boundaries, and they remind everyone in the conversation that belief doesn't get special privileges just because it's old or popular. There's also a tendency in some religious arguments to make bold, universal claims, like everyone deep down believes in God, or without God, life has no meaning. Those are sweeping statements, and they collapse the moment you introduce a counterexample. You can just say, well, I don't believe in God and my life is full of meaning, so that statement can't be true for everyone. It's not combative, it's just fact-checking. Sometimes all it takes is one calm contradiction to poke a hole in an overgeneralization. And sometimes, maybe most times, religious arguments don't need to be refuted point by point. They just need to be met with better questions. More honest questions. Questions that don't pretend to have all the answers, but that push past slogans and into actual thought. Questions like, how do you know what you believe is true? What would change your mind? Do you apply the same standards of evidence to other claims in your life? Because that's really what we're asking for in these conversations. Not perfect answers, but consistency, accountability, a willingness to treat religious ideas like we treat every other kind of claim. You wouldn't accept "I just feel it" as a reason to trust a doctor, or an engineer, or a pilot, so why accept it from someone making claims about the origin of the universe, the purpose of life, and the fate of your soul? It's not disrespectful to ask that question, it's responsible. And if someone ever tells you that asking those kinds of questions is arrogant, or rebellious, or sinful, that's a red flag right there. Because genuine truth should never fear a question. It shouldn't need protection from inquiry. If something is true, it can stand up to being examined. And if it can't, then maybe it's not as true as people think. A lot of religious arguments, if you step back far enough, rely on special pleading. They make exceptions for themselves that they wouldn't accept anywhere else, like demanding absolute proof for evolution but settling for vague stories and metaphors when it comes to their own holy texts, or criticizing the science they don't like, vaccines, climate research, evolutionary biology, while using the science they do like, cell phones, GPS, medicine, without a second thought. That inconsistency doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means their beliefs are insulated from the kind of scrutiny they'd apply to almost anything else. So one of the most effective things you can do, and this takes patience, is to hold those beliefs to the same standards people already accept in the rest of their lives. Not to attack, but to align. If they value evidence in medicine, why not in theology? If they want fairness in law, why accept favoritism in divine judgment? If they care about human rights in their country, why follow a book that condones slavery or the subjugation of women? These aren't gotcha questions. They're honest attempts to find coherence, because coherence matters. You can't build a solid worldview out of pieces that contradict each other. And if someone says, "Well, it's all about faith, you just have to believe," that's your cue to step back. Because once a conversation moves into the realm of faith, it's no longer a debate about truth, it's a statement about loyalty. Faith isn't about what's real. It's about what someone wants to be real, or needs to be real, and that's why it's so often immune to evidence. Not because it's above reason, but because it was never built on reason to begin with. That's why religious arguments can feel so slippery. They start with logic, then shift into metaphor, then into mystery, then into emotion, and before you know it, you're not even having a conversation. You're being asked to stand on a rug that keeps moving. You don't have to chase it. You can just say, if the truth of your claim keeps changing when it's questioned, that doesn't make it deep, it makes it unfalsifiable. And an unfalsifiable claim might feel profound, but it's not useful, because it explains everything and nothing at once. It's okay to walk away from those kinds of arguments, not because you've lost, but because the game was rigged from the start, and your time, your mind, your attention, they're not infinite, they're worth protecting. There's also this. Some people use religious arguments not to persuade, but to dominate. They throw out rapid-fire claims, hoping you can't respond to all of them. It's called the Gish Gallop, and it's not a good faith tactic. When that happens, slow things down. Pick one claim, one point, and examine it. If that point fails, then it shows that speed isn't strength, depth is. Or just ask, if your argument needs to overwhelm rather than explain, is it really about truth? That kind of question resets the dynamic. It puts the burden back where it belongs. And here's something else to keep in mind. You don't have to have the last word. You don't have to walk away having won the argument. It's not the point. Sometimes just asking one solid question is enough. That question might stick in someone's mind for days, weeks, years. You won't always see the impact, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. That's how most minds change, actually. Not all at once, in a single debate, but slowly, from small cracks in certainty, from moments of pause that grow into deeper reflection. You might be the first person who ever said, "I don't believe that," without apology, without shame. And that matters. Just your calm refusal to nod along can plant a seed. Even if they argue back, even if they get defensive, there's now a part of their mind that knows not everyone accepts these claims, and that those who don't aren't monsters. And that's the beginning of something important. Over time, you start to realize that handling religious arguments isn't really about debating. It's about being steady in yourself, clear in your thinking, and honest about what you do and don't know. It's not about memorizing a dozen counterpoints or learning every flaw in ancient texts. It's about staying grounded in what makes a belief trustworthy in the first place. Evidence, consistency, logic, and the willingness to change if the facts demand it. Religious arguments often don't meet those standards, but yours can, and that's the difference people feel, even if they can't articulate it. Because when someone argues from faith, they're trying to protect something. But when you speak from reason, you're not protecting, you're exploring. That's what makes your voice so different. It's not here to dominate or convert. It's here to clarify, to ask better questions, to remove the fog. And once the fog lifts, even just a little, people start to see how much they were leaning on it. There's also something freeing about stepping outside those old scripts, those repetitive cycles of claim and counterclaim. Once you realize you don't need to play every game someone invites you into, that you can choose which conversations matter and which ones just drain you, you start to conserve your energy for the moments that really count. Some arguments aren't worth engaging, and that's not giving up, it's choosing your battles with wisdom. You don't need to spend hours explaining why you don't believe in a God who punishes thought, or why you don't take scripture literally, or why you're skeptical of personal visions, ancient rules, or eternal rewards. You can just say, that doesn't make sense to me, and I'm okay not believing it. Sometimes that's all it takes to shift the dynamic, not by attacking, but by standing still, like saying, I've heard that before, and I'm still not convinced, and letting the silence speak for itself. Because real strength in these conversations doesn't come from how loudly or quickly you respond. It comes from how clearly you hold your ground, how confidently you live without needing invisible approval, how calmly you let go of beliefs that demand your obedience in exchange for belonging. You'll find over time that your presence alone, your refusal to play along with ideas that don't hold up, becomes more persuasive than any debate. You're not here to prove that you're right. You're just here to live truthfully, to ask honest questions, and to resist the pressure to pretend. And when someone challenges you or even tries to shame you for not sharing their beliefs, you can meet that challenge with calm, with clarity, and with the quiet strength that comes from thinking for yourself. Because that's really what matters most in these conversations, not whether someone agrees with you in the end, but whether you stayed true to your values, your integrity, your mind, and maybe, just maybe, your clarity will help someone else find their own.